Welcome back, everyone. Great to see your faces again. This is our final session together for the evening before we move into our reception. So in other words, less than an hour between here and an open bar. And yes, I did say those two words. I'm trying to win you guys over. I just don't think I've done it yet, but I thought, when I tell them there's an open bar, these folks will finally like me. We do have a very distinguished guest with us for the last portion of our time together. Chris Nyrop is the lead National Support Director. Throughout the day, we have heard several different perspectives on how we can make our community safer while allowing for the redirection of critical but scarce resources to address some of the root causes of crime, including substance abuse and mental illness. To place all of these individual efforts into a broader context, Mr. Nyrop, the lead National Support Director, will walk us through what we have learned over the past 40 years about what works in addressing low-level criminal activity driven by behavioral health issues. And after exploring lessons learned, he will highlight several potential paths forward to achieve not only better outcomes for individuals, but for our criminal justice system as a whole. Please welcome Mr. Nyrop.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for you brave souls who have stuck it out to the very bitter end of the day. And yes, open bar sounds like a great thing to follow this up with. So I know you've been deluged with data all day, and I'm going to try and not do that for you or to you. Mostly what I'm going to do is tell a story or tell a series of stories and try and weave them together, and hopefully they will make sense to you and make you feel positive about the work that you're already doing, and hopefully give you encouragement to go out and do some more. I do have some data in here, but I'm going to try and avoid that and stick mostly to just telling you things about what has happened and what could possibly happen. Having said all of that, I'm going to start with a fairly dystopian picture of some history over the last 40 years and then move into conversations about other things that are happening and possible ways out of that dystopian history. But before I do that, I just want to start with a couple of things to get you thinking and sort of set the stage for my perspective and what the rest of the talk will be about. So the first thing I want to do is start out with a definition of a drug addict. So over the last 30 or 40 years, there has been a tremendous amount of debate, and you could fill several bookshelves of books that have been written about addiction and what it is. And there are hundreds of scholarly journal articles and lots of popular press things about what is addiction. And so I came up many years ago with my own definition of a drug addict. This was stolen from Dylan Thomas, who famously said that an alcoholic was someone who drank more than he did, and he drank himself to death. So I think that was a fairly high bar for alcoholism. So my definition for a drug addict is someone that you don't like who does a different drug than you do. And I use this because it illustrates both sort of the sociological reality, and a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about drug addiction is sociological stuff, not pharmacological or medical or anything like that. So it illustrates some ways in which drug users differ and ways in which this has policy implications. So let me just tell you where this sort of came from in my head. So many years ago, we started doing syringe exchange in downtown Seattle as a form of HIV prevention. And we'd go out to the street corner right near the Pike Place Market, and we'd set up a card table. People would come by, and they'd put their dirty syringes into a sharps container, and we'd give them clean ones back. So we'd been doing this for a couple of months, and I'm sitting there one day, and there's a gentleman who's exchanging syringes, and this is someone I've come to know in the time that we've been there. He's in his mid-50s, someone who's been using heroin since he was in his early 20s, so someone with a 30-year career of heroin addiction or heroin use. So he's exchanging his syringes, and this drunk staggers by. And he looks over at the drunk, and he looks back at me, and in a voice filled with pity and sympathy, he says, "Thank God I'm not an alcoholic." And I'm like, really? Because, on society's ladder, you're pretty much down there on the bottom rung with that guy. But I don't say anything. I just think about it. A couple of weeks later, I'm sitting there at the table. Same basic thing is happening. Some guy's there. He's exchanging syringes. And a drunk walks by, and this time the roles are reversed and there's not much pity or sympathy. The drunk looks over at the guy who's exchanging syringes and says, "Effing junkie." And I'm like, really? So just started thinking about that. And then a couple of years later, we opened up another syringe exchange program up on Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, where, unlike downtown, there were a very high preponderance of methamphetamine users, where we had about half of the folks were primarily heroin users and the other half were primarily methamphetamine users. And we had so many conflicts between those two groups that the staff seriously considered having dope fiend night and tweaker night at the exchange, because they were constantly butting heads with each other. So I could go on and on and on about the ways that drug users themselves differ and stigmatize. It's the other people that have the problem, not me, not my group. But this also has policy implications in terms of the laws we pass and how we view people who use drugs. So another quick example here from a newspaper that no longer exists, and it concerns a basketball team that no longer exists, or at least not in Seattle. So many years ago, we had this newspaper in town. It was a Hearst paper called the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. And one day they ran side-by-side articles in the paper. And one of the articles was on the problem of chronic public inebriates, street alcoholics in downtown Seattle. And the Seattle City Council had just passed what they called an alcohol impact area. And this was going to limit the size of containers. Basically, what they were doing was targeting 40 ounces, and they were going to prohibit the mini markets from selling 40 ounces. Now, you could still go in and buy 8% high-test microbrew. You just couldn't buy the cheap stuff. So it was all about the problem with these chronic public inebriates and what the city council was going to do about it. Right next to it, and I really have to wonder whether the editor really was making an editorial comment by the juxtaposition of these articles, but right next to it was an article on how the Seattle Supersonics and the city of Seattle were not making enough money off of alcohol sales at Key Arena. And so they were going to implement seat-side cocktail service, where you wouldn't need to get up from your seat to get a beverage. They would bring it right to you. And I'm like looking at these articles and thinking, yeah, street drunks are a really big problem, but how are most people getting to Key Arena? They're driving. And we're wanting to facilitate their alcohol consumption. But again, one group are addicts and the other group are not. So this is just one way that this sort of plays out. Okay, the other thing I just want to say to get you thinking about this a little bit is that one of the things that has been really common over the last 5 or 6 years has been talking about the disease model of addiction. So you see people using phrases like, chronic relapsing medical condition or a brain disease or some type of medical model for this. And there are some definite positives and there are some drawbacks to the medical model of addiction. But one thing that strikes me is that if addiction really is a disease, it's the only disease where we require the patient to give up their symptoms before we offer to treat that condition. And so this is one of the key lessons that we've learned over the years is being able to treat the symptoms of that disease before we require people to stop from it. So if you think of just for a second about hypertension, if someone went into their doctor and the doctor believed that they had behaviorally induced hypertension, and if the doctor said to that person, well, I want you to quit eating meat, quit eating cheese, and I want you to walk for at least 45 minutes a day, and come back a month from now, and if your blood pressure is still really high, then we'll put you on blood pressure medication. But that's a lot of what we require people who are out there on the street, who are homeless, who are using drugs. We say, we want you to do X, Y, and Z before we'll offer you the types of services that might actually result in you decreasing or quitting your drug use. So the classic example of this really is housing first. Housing first says it all. That's all you need to know. It is housing before anything else. But increasingly we see in places that are trying to do housing first, folks that want to say, well, actually you need to do this before we'll give you housing. That's not housing first. And what we do know is that housing first is highly effective with these folks. All right. So let me read you something from Tuesday's New York Times, and this is from an article titled, "Even in Texas, Mass Incarceration is Going Out of Style." So they're talking about partisan gridlock, both at the federal level and at the state level, and they say, on one serious problem, continued progress is not only possible, it's probable. That is reducing incarceration. In an era of what seems like unprecedented polarization and rancor, this idea has bipartisan support. The Koch brothers and Black Lives Matter agree. The American Civil Liberties Union and the American Conservative Union Foundation agree. Bernie Sanders and Newt Gingrich agree. Here's what they agree on. The United States went overboard on mass incarceration in the 1980s and 1990s. This has ruined a lot of lives, of those incarcerated, yes, but also of others among their families and communities. The evidence says that harsher sentences don't prevent crime and may even lead to more crime. Jailing people is really, really expensive. Prison brings no help and much harm to the 80% of prisoners who are addicted to drugs or mentally ill. So that actually is my whole talk. And I could just stop right there. If there's nothing else that you get from what I say this afternoon, that really is it. But I think that the people who invited me to come would be really annoyed if I said, let's just leave right now. So I will keep talking for a little bit longer, if you will indulge me. So after 30 years of doing public health and public safety work, and the last 8 years spent completely on criminal justice, that's what I know, is that people are coming together and agreeing that the status quo has not been working and it's time to do something different. And they're looking at what all of those differences are. So we see this from major urban areas to small towns. We see it from deep blue Seattle to ultra-red Fayetteville, North Carolina. We see it from law enforcement to business owners to community groups to civil rights advocates and to drug policy reformers. All of them sort of coalescing around this idea the status quo is not really working for them. It's not working for different reasons. Each one of those groups has a different reason for why they think the status quo isn't working, and they might really fundamentally disagree about some of that, but they agree that it's not and that it's time to do something different. And they also agree that it's only by working together that they can get out of the mess that we've created or inherited, depending on our age. I'm giving those of you who are much too young to be guilty of any of the sins we've committed in the past 40 years. You get a pass on that. Okay, so I want to just tell you a little story here about and illustrate some of this. So in Seattle, we had undergone years and years of really contentious debate over drug arrests, really focusing on racial disparity in drug arrests. And it was really contentious, and people were not very kind to each other and said nasty things in the press, let alone behind their backs. And at the end of one round of litigation, we were having this meeting, and the person who was captain of narcotics for the Seattle Police Department turned out to be a really visionary individual, Captain Steve Brown. We're having this meeting, and Captain Brown said, okay, assuming everything you guys, and by you guys he meant the people criticizing the police department, assuming everything you guys say is true, what would you have us do differently? And he was met with crickets chirping, because nobody actually had an answer to that question. People had, rhetorical answers, end the war on drugs. Well, that's slightly above the pay grade of a captain in a mid-sized police department. So people started thinking and talking to each other, and this started a long conversation. And there were a bunch of questions that came up in that, one of which was, what if we actually could all work together for a common purpose? What if we could make arrest the strategy of last resort for low-level criminal activity associated with behavioral health? What if we could change what is almost uniformly a bad outcome, going to jail and getting prosecuted, into something that was a positive outcome for the person who was coming in contact with the police officer? And what if this actually yielded a better public safety outcome at the same time, made community groups and business groups feel better? What if it was cheaper? The simple answer to this question was yes, that we could do that. But it took us 6 years to get to the point that resulted in law enforcement-assisted diversion. So we took that question of Captain Brown's, we spent a lot of time thinking about it, and then we developed law enforcement-assisted diversion, or LEAD. And we implemented it in 2011. So we've been doing it a little over 5 years, and we are answering those questions with a resounding yes. And we are seeing this play out in communities all across the United States. So here's where I get sort of into the dystopian history for a little bit, and I just want to talk. There's a lot of reasons why we got into the condition that we're in, where the status quo is broken, and again, books could be written about them. I'm just going to focus real briefly on 3 of them. One of which is the effect of the war on drugs. The second of which is deinstitutionalization and the systemic neglect of those with mental illness. And the third is homelessness. And I won't belabor this, but just to sort of get into how we got here. So obviously the war on drugs is a really big, huge issue. And Nixon famously proclaimed it in 1972. But the massive increase in incarceration really began in the 1980s and went really crazy after 1996. And some of it was just really political. So, for example, the 100-to-1 disparity in sentencing for possession of crack cocaine. That has absolutely no basis in science at all. Pharmacologically, the 2 substances are identical to each other. They have the same effect on each other. But this was a perfect illustration of my definition of a drug addict being someone that you don't like that's using a different drug than you do. So we passed these sentences and we really ramped things up. And just to give you a local example of how this played out, so we had a prosecutor, the King County prosecutor in Washington State, who was a big drug warrior. And in the 1980s, he went to the Washington State legislature and started asking for increased penalties for drug possession and sales. And he got it. We didn't go to mandatory minimums, but we went to determinate sentencing, which ratcheted up your sentence at each time. And we got to the point where you could get 120 months, 10 years in prison for selling $20 worth of drugs. I actually had an employee of mine who spent 5 years at the women's prison in Washington State at Purdy for facilitating the sale of a $20 bag of heroin. And I had someone I'd known since high school who spent 120 months at the Washington State prison in Monroe for selling a half gram of crack cocaine, which was about $40 worth. So, this was sort of the situation that we had. The result of that was that by 2008, 26% of inmates in the Washington State Penitentiary were there for drugs alone. And nationally in that year, we passed over 2 million people in federal and state prisons who were in for drug crimes. So again, just a little bit of data here real quickly just to illustrate some of the magnitude of what happened. In 1973, there were 200,000 people in federal and state prisons. In 2014, that was 1.5 million, so 7 times higher in that period. And on any given day, 750,000 people are inside jails, and another 13 million bodies cycle through jails on an annual basis. And the cost of this is really enormous. So the cost of federal and state prisons went from $12 billion in 1984 to $60 billion in 2014, so a 5-fold increase. All right, so this looks really bad. It's untenable and it's unsustainable. People see how much money gets spent on criminal justice and they rebel and they ask for other solutions. And increasingly, they're looking at things like justice reinvestment, like LEAD, like the ANGEL program in Gloucester, Massachusetts, like other programs that can divert people away from the criminal justice system. So one of the first waves of trying to extricate ourselves from this was really the rise of therapeutic courts in the early 1990s. So I mentioned Norm Mailing before. So one of his first exit strategies from the monstrosity he had created was an embracement of drug courts, and he became a strong proponent of drug courts. And the more that he saw they worked, the more he expanded them. So he had mental health court, he had veterans court, he had community courts, things that were an alternative to this. And he actually went back to the legislature and tried to undo some of the damage that he had done. And he actually got to the point that he started sending his senior deputy prosecutor, Dan Satterberg, who is our current King County prosecutor. In the late 1990s, he started sending Dan to meetings of the King County Bar Association's Drug Policy Reform Task Force. So he was actually engaging in trying to undo the damage of those draconian drug laws. And Dan ended up embracing lead and has been one of our biggest champions. So that's sort of the war on drugs thing. And then just real briefly, and I know this came up in this morning's session, we cannot overlook the effect of the massive deinstitutionalization of people with mental illness. And the first round of this occurred in the 1960s and was largely driven by the personal experience of JFK, who had a family member who had been institutionalized for a long period of time, and he wanted to deinstitutionalize mental illness and try and destigmatize it. So that was the first wave, and then the second wave, quite ironically, was in the 1980s and was driven by budget decisions, the desire to reduce the amount of money that was spent. And the reason I say ironically was that we were defunding all of these mental health services at precisely the same time as we were increasing the penalties for other behavioral health conditions, such as substance use. And so that helped contribute to that increase in incarceration, a large part. So again, just a couple of quick numbers to illustrate this. So right now, 64% of jail inmates, 54% of state prison inmates, and 45% of federal prison inmates report mental health concerns, and many of them also report substance use. But the biggest impact here is on the local level, where local jurisdictions, local police officers, they're the ones that bear the brunt of all of this. They're on the front lines. They're the ones that are being asked to do something. And so a moment of revelation for me on this front came back in the mid-1990s when the director of the Seattle King County Health Department was at a meeting, and he said the largest public health clinic in Washington State is the King County Jail. And the largest mental health facility is the King County Jail. And that was the first time I'd heard someone say that. And I was like, that's just nuts. That's totally crazy that we're asking them to do that. And this is not isolated. So a year or so ago, I heard the Cook County Sheriff for Cook County, Illinois, saying that the largest mental health facility in his state was the Cook County Jail. And he went on to say that he did not go into law enforcement to run a mental health facility. Neither he nor his guards nor his deputies wanted to be in that business. They wanted out of it. And about a year or so ago, the LA County Sheriff made the same thing, and the LA County Jail is actually the largest mental health facility in the entire United States. And just this Monday, the chief of police for the Cleveland Police Department was making a very similar comment that his jail is the largest mental health facility. The interesting thing that the Cleveland chief was identifying was that his city, his police department, is under a consent decree with the Department of Justice. And one of the key findings in that consent decree was a pattern of excessive force against people who were mentally ill. And he was making the case that, we shouldn't be the ones that are having to do this. Someone else should be out there. And so we're seeing increasingly responses to this, such as crisis intervention training, the opening of 24-hour-a-day facilities where police officers can take people who are mentally ill rather than having to take them into jail. And so, and Chief Brendan Cox, who recently retired from the Albany Police Department, I was at a meeting with him a week ago, and he made the comment that, and this gets to those of you who inherited the problems rather than creating it. He said, I was 1 year old when the war on drugs was announced. I didn't cause this. I didn't decide this. I didn't have anything to do with emptying mental institutions. But as officers, we're expected to do something about it. So there's the mental illness part of this. And I'll just real briefly talk about the homeless part of it, which is that homelessness is obviously a really big issue, especially on the West Coast of the United States. Pretty much every city of any size on the West Coast has tent encampments and skyrocketing numbers of homelessness. There's a lot of systemic reasons for that. I just want to illustrate one, which is at the end of the 1970s, the supply of low-cost, affordable housing was greater than the demand for it by a fairly wide margin. And that is absolutely not the case today. The supply of affordable housing nationwide is grossly inferior to the demand for it. And we've seen this play out all over the landscape. All right, so just one final thing here on the dystopian nightmare, and this also came up this morning, which has to do with racial disparity in drug arrests. I used the phrase before about the war on drugs. Well, the recently exiting head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, Michael Botticelli, said when he took office that the war on drugs is a complete misnomer. You cannot have a war on things. You have a war on some people who use some drugs. And that has been what's played out and has driven a lot of what we've seen that has created tension between police departments and communities throughout the United States. That war has it's driven a deep divide between law enforcement and many communities. The irony is that many poor and minority communities actually feel deeply underserved and targeted at the same time. So, in fact, they feel that serious crime is ignored in their neighborhoods, but that relatively small-level crimes like selling loose cigarettes or driving with a broken taillight are the ones that receive the brunt of law enforcement. Okay, so that's the litany of things that are bad. And after that, and a discussion of what has gone wrong, what is there to possibly feel good about? And so my answer to that is you guys. What you're doing, and it's Justice Reinvestment, it's LEAD, it's all of the programs that have been evolving over the last 10, 15, 20 years in some cases. It's the ways in which people are breaking down silos and reaching across jurisdictional boundaries to actually sit at the table and talk to each other and come up with concrete, locally based solutions to their individual problems, to talk and plan and implement new and creative ways of doing things. So this is a story, what you guys are doing in this summit here. This is something to celebrate and to emulate and to promote. Things are really happening at the state and local level right now. And it's not just about saving money, but it's also about getting much, much better outcomes for individuals and for communities. And I go back to my comment before about the status quo being broken. That's a comment that comes up repeatedly in the work that I do around the country, where people are just like, things right now aren't working, and what is it that we can do? What can we learn from what's out there? And so there, and lots of people are coming around. So I mentioned crusty old drug warriors, and that's actually what they referred to themselves, Norm Mailing and Dan Satterberg on the prosecutorial side, and then Captain Brown, who laid the pathwork for coming up to LEAD. So there are all sorts of things that have happened to facilitate this discussion. And I just want to talk for a little bit right now about some of the thinking that has led to where we're at in terms of developing new things. So one thing I want to talk about is harm reduction, which is the essence of what law enforcement assisted diversion is. It's the essence of housing first, and it is critical to a lot of the conversations that are happening here. So harm reduction really emerged in the mid to late 1980s, and it grew out of HIV prevention efforts with people who use drugs. And for those of you that weren't around then, or maybe your memory has faded with time, in the late 1980s, HIV meant that you were going to get AIDS and you were going to die. And you were going to die a really miserable, horrible death. It was going to be ugly, and that was what was going to happen. So there was a really high degree of urgency, a sense of needing to do something right now, of needing pragmatic, cheap, easy to implement tools, condoms for sex, syringe exchange for people who were using drugs, stuff that you could implement right overnight. Harm reduction itself is not really a theory, it's a practice, but it is informed by theories of behavior change, in particular stages of change in Maslow's hierarchy, the idea of literally and figuratively needing to meet people where they're at. It was fairly controversial at the time. It is still controversial in some areas, but it has been very thoroughly studied, and we've learned a lot of lessons from doing this over time. And so I mentioned the importance of meeting people where they're at, both literally and figuratively. So the literally is something that we're seeing play out in a lot of the sort of criminal justice programs, of the need to interact with people where they are. So if people are homeless and don't have identification and are sleeping underneath a freeway, that's where you need to go. You need to go and find those people and interact with them where they are and offer them stuff to get them out of that situation. And the figuratively part, again, is meeting people. If someone is not ready to say, I want treatment, are they willing to say, are they willing to come indoors? Are they willing to get housing first? And so one of the early lessons that came out of harm reduction was that police and public health, that public safety and public health often work at cross purposes with each other, and that's something that needs to be rectified. So obviously one of the first things that came up had to do with needle exchange, and then you had laws around paraphernalia possession. Those two can't coexist at the same time. Something needs to happen to change that. The other thing that came up was using possession of condoms as evidence of prostitution. So one of my first experiences with this was talking to a Kenyan police officer, and he was talking about the fact that the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, all of these huge major international foundations were coming into Kenya and were distributing condoms by the hundreds of millions. And they had all of these billboards up about using condoms. And they were trying to promote this because they had a huge sexually driven HIV epidemic. And at the same time, the police department was using possession of condoms as evidence of prostitution. So if you had more than 2 condoms, the police would arrest you. And so he's like, that's really quite crazy because no one's going to carry condoms on them if we're going to arrest them. So, he implemented a change within his department, and they actually started having like volleyball games for the sex workers and trying to change how they interacted with that population to try and actually convince them that the public safety side was on their side as well and was in favor of their public health. And it started disproving all sorts of ideas. So when I started doing this work, the axiom that once someone was an addict, they were always an addict was absolutely true. It was an article of faith in a lot of the people that we were working with. And there was another article of faith was that drug users didn't care about their own health, that they wouldn't actually do anything to improve their health. But by the work we were doing, we were able to see that both of those things were untrue, that in fact, most people who do use substances end up stopping using those substances or dramatically reducing them over time. And that people actually were really concerned about their health and would do something about it if they were given an opportunity to do it. And again, just another example of how public health and public safety could operate in conflict with each other, but could transform that and work together. So this example comes from Seattle. So we had a park in Seattle in the late 1980s that was characterized by a very high amount of outdoor sex and gay men cruising in the park. And it was getting the police department was getting a lot of complaints. And the captain of the Seattle Police Department East Precinct realized that this was not something that he wanted the police department to get involved in at all. So he got a pair of night vision goggles, and he got someone from the health department, and they drove up to the park one evening, and he handed the health department person the goggles and said, "Take a look at this." He said, "This is not my problem. This is your problem. you need to do something about this because I am not sending a Seattle police officer into this park to deal with this issue. I want to see outreach workers up here, and I want them up here at 2 in the morning, and I want them to do something about this. And so he stepped back from that, and the health department did. They got very proactively involved in going up and doing very outreach in the evening to this. And so that was a way where public health and public safety could actually work together at the same time to achieve an outcome that was beneficial for individuals but also benefited the community. And so this started all sorts of other talk locally about doing things. It's one of the lessons of Housing First. Housing First is not just about saving money. It's about improving the wellness of the individuals that get put into Housing First, but it's also about improving the wellness of the community around it. So one of the very first Housing First programs that was totally, people were specifically recruited. So the agency that built a Housing First building in Seattle called 1811, they went to the emergency room and they got the name of like the 77, 78 most frequent flyers, utilizers of the emergency room. In some cases, these were people who were being brought in not just pretty much daily, but in some cases twice a day for being picked up out on the street. Some of them had cost over $1 million themselves in the emergency room. And so they went out and they recruited these individuals and they said, would you accept housing where you are allowed to drink on site? And they had like 75 beds, and it took them asking 78 people to fill the 75 beds. So one of the things that was not at all surprising was that it dramatically reduced emergency room costs. And the building paid for itself in reduced emergency room costs within like a year and a half. The counterintuitive aspect of this was that most of the individuals that were referred into this housing reduced their alcohol consumption. This was something that the research literature had said was impossible, that a late-stage chronic alcoholic, the odds of them quitting or reducing their drinking was like 14%. Yet they were seeing this happen a lot. And so I was having a conversation with the executive director of the agency, and he was like, think about it. He's like, if you're out on the street and you're drinking, he's like, you've got to drink it all at once, because if you don't, the police are likely to come by and pour it out. Or one of your buddies is going to come by and make you share it, and you don't have a place to stash it. So you've got to consume it right there and then. He's like, but if you actually have your own place and you have a cupboard and you can put your beer in there, there's like no urgency around consuming it. And he said, so what people do is they're like really content with the fact that there's beer there that I can get when I want it. So this was an early example of again, meeting people where they're at on that originally was quite controversial. So the creation of this building was crazy. Editorials against it, talk radio shows talking against it. What happened, though, was that overnight, people noticed the difference that happened. And so our Downtown Business Association is now one of the strongest promoters of Housing First because they can see that it has such a positive impact on the community. So harm reduction, Housing First, these things have been something of a hurdle for some of our colleagues in LEAD in terms of replicating around the country, where they are thinking, why would I want to do this? And the two biggest things that have helped people overcome that emotional barrier to doing that, again, the status quo is not working. And B, seeing the change that happens. So let me just give you an example of the status quo not working and how it can change some thinking here. So the very first night that we did LEAD in Seattle, and this was a diversion program for people being arrested for low-level drug offenses. And one of the officers that had been most openly skeptical about doing lead, when we did the training at roll call, she'd been sitting there just like shaking her head, and she muttered under her breath like, yeah, like I'm going to do that. And so, as it turns out, luck of the draw, she's the one that does the first arrest. And she runs a records check on this guy, and he's got 56 prior drug arrests in Seattle. And she said, yeah, 57's probably not going to make a difference here. And so she went ahead and diverted the person into lead. And relatively rapidly, we started seeing change in that person, and this helped to get officer buy-in. And another one of our examples, and for those of you that were in the lead talk earlier, I apologize for the repetition of this, but we had a guy who was living in a downtown parking garage, who'd been living there for 20-some years. And his primary issue was mental illness, but he also was using drugs on top of it. And he was the source of a lot of neighborhood complaints, a lot of community complaints, and the police were just utterly exhausted with this guy. They just had it. They didn't know what else to do with him. They just kept arresting him on trespass charges all over the place. And so what ended up happening was he got diverted into lead, and his lead case managers were able to get him housing. And for like the first 6 months or so, he would go and stay at the housing maybe 1 or 2 nights a week and spend 5 or 6 nights a week at his house at the parking garage. And then after another 6 months, the ratio changed. And for about the last year or so, he just visits the parking garage. And so police see that change, and it's something that they understand and they get. And what it has also taught them, and this is like one of the lessons that I've seen happen over and over again, is the benefits of cross-system collaboration. That the issues that we're grappling with are something that the police cannot do alone, the prosecutors cannot do alone, the treatment agencies, the housing agencies, the case managers, none of them can do this in isolation. They all need to be at the table actually talking to each other and learning from each other. And it requires social workers and public health types learning about what police work is and what it is police officers do. And it involves police and prosecutors learning what addiction is, what mental illness is, and how to address it. One of my police friends in Seattle said that when she went to the training academy, she was taught how to drive fast, how to shoot accurately, and how to put handcuffs on. And she received precisely 0 minutes of training in chemical dependency or mental illness. And she was like, my entire professional career could have been transformed if I had had that training right from the start and had to know how to deal with these issues as a rookie beat cop and what to do in that situation. And this dialogue can result in really interesting situations, and it can result in people sort of thinking out of the box. And so one of our examples here was from a lead project where there was a case manager and one of the police officers who were having like sort of a friendly rivalry and debate. So the police officer had diverted someone into the lead program, and the case manager, after a few months, was like, this is the hardest individual I have ever worked with in my entire life. I am done with him. I cannot do another thing. And the police officer was like, oh, no, you don't. He's gained 20 pounds in the last few months, and I've seen him wearing clean clothes. You are sticking with this guy. Whatever it is you're doing, you have to stick with him. And the case manager was like, no, please, I'm done with him. As it turned out, the guy just became an Uber driver a couple of weeks ago. He's been like clean and sober for 3 years now in his house. So this was a victory on the part of the police of demanding that the case manager stick in there with someone, and the police themselves articulating these sort of harm reduction based arguments. The other thing is that these types of programs can totally change the relationship between police and communities. So it changes the relationship between the police and those they divert. So one of the things that we've seen is in areas that have done some sort of diversion or deflection model, no matter what it is, that if you interview the people that have been diverted into the programs and you ask them about what were their thoughts about police or experiences with police prior to the program, they'll routinely say things like, oh, whenever I saw Officer so-and-so, I used to run and hide. And now they talk about the fact that they go up to the officer that made the diversion possible and they brag about what they've done and they thank the officer. And we've seen this play out where people will get their first paycheck that they've had in 20 years and they'll come up and very proudly show the officer their paycheck or that they've been reunited with their families. And then we see that the individuals themselves, when they recognize that the police are actually a portal of entry into something that can help them, they actually approach the police and ask for help, which again is not something that they used to do. We see this play out with LEAD, and it's certainly played out with what's called the ANGEL program out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, where they promise someone if they come into the department and they ask for help, they will be given treatment and they won't be arrested if they've got existing warrants. They won't be arrested if they're possession of drugs. So it fundamentally changes those dynamics and creates the space for people to behave in ways that they might not otherwise do. And the other thing about doing this type of thing is that it gives police another tool. So for too long, police have only had two options when they see behavior out on the street, one of which is they don't see it. They just pretend that that didn't happen, or that they have to arrest someone for it. So giving them these deflection or diversion tools is another tool in the toolbox for police, and one that they willingly engage with, because quite honestly, most of the time, they know that the arrest is not going to result in any positive change for that individual, but it's the only option they have at that particular moment. So giving them other options or other things to do is something that is critically important and that is widely embraced. And it also starts to change their thinking about what they do, so that what happens is you start seeing police officers who, after engaging in these programs, make comments, well, why would I arrest that person for possession of a crack pipe? That makes absolutely no sense. I can just call a case manager and get something else to come out of that situation. And so I've seen this take place over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, really ramping up. And it gets people who normally never talk to each other except when they're in court in front of a judge to come together and start meeting regularly and socialize with each other, travel. The anthropologists used to have a saying that you knew you understood another culture when you know when to laugh. And that's one of the things I've seen out as these LEAD programs play out in other types of programs, is you get people who, where they start out being really tense, and after enough meetings, suddenly they're laughing at each other's jokes, and they're getting along with each other. And they also mourn with each other when they have bad outcomes. We have people who die in these programs, and sometimes it's very upsetting. It also involves people being willing to compromise and give things up. So I'll just give you an example here of really early on of doing a compromise that sometimes can yield or end up being funny years later. So when we were first designing the eligibility criteria for LEAD in Seattle, one of the things that we were talking about was what would be the threshold, the amount above which you could not have for possession or sales of drugs. And Captain Brown had suggested that the threshold be 3 grams. And me being a smarty pants know-it-all, I'm like, well, 3.5 grams is an 8-ball out on the street. And if it actually has a name, it probably is something that's important. So why don't we go for 3.5 grams? And it was one of those things where Captain Brown turns to me and he goes, Chris, that's a lot of dope. And I'm like, and 3 grams isn't a lot of dope? This is the first time I've ever argued with a police officer over half a gram. But, okay, I'll let it go. We'll go with 3 grams. And as it turned out, the 3-gram limit turned out to be almost irrelevant, because virtually all of the people that were being arrested for half a gram. So it really didn't become a meaningful thing. But what was interesting about this was after a couple of years of doing LEAD, the police department themselves wanted to increase the limit to 7 grams because they'd arrested a couple of people who'd been over the 3-gram limit, and they were like, well, they'd be good candidates for LEAD. And so, what originally was something that was a source of some tension, and like maybe we should do this, maybe we shouldn't, after that they were willing to give it up and really start moving adventurously. And we're seeing this happen that as more and more places around the country start to experiment with these types of programs, they have a freedom to think out of the box in a way that they didn't. So when we started in Seattle, we were very, very conservative and pretty limited in who we would offer these diversion programs to. And what we've seen as other cities do this, that they start incorporating more and more crimes as eligible or more and more things. And the Albany Police Department has been one that opened this up, where the Albany Police Department started in April of last year, and they basically said any crime that the officer felt was attributable to a substance use disorder, to mental health issues, or to poverty, that those would be eligible for diversion. So they just really opened up the box in terms of the range of people that they would be willing to offer these high-level, intense services to. And I think it's because, at the end of this whole process, what we're learning is that we all want the same thing. We want safer and healthier communities. We want safer and healthy individuals. We all want to go home at the end of the day, literally and figuratively. And we want that to happen, and we know that the ways that we've been trying to address this in the past have not yielded those results. And so we're looking for ways to get out of that. And this is, as I said before, it's playing out all over the place, from red states to blue ones. And the beauty of what you guys are doing and the things that are being talked about here in Oregon and in other places, it can be done at the local level. It does not require changing laws, and this may be something that becomes relevant over the next few years. It doesn't require federal approval. It can be done at the local level organically. Nobody can tell a local police department who they have to arrest. That is a decision that can be made at the local level. No one can tell a local prosecutor who he or she has to prosecute. That is something that is entirely within their power and discretion to do. And so no matter what happens at the federal level, these types of local organic changes can continue to happen and can do. So as the New York Times quote that I started with reminds us, this is really a bipartisan issue. People can really come together over this issue. And one of the few rays of light at the federal level was a year ago, there was the creation of what is called the Heroin Caucus, which has now something like 70 members in both the House and Senate, both Republican and Democrats, who are from states that have been severely affected by the opioid overdose issue, and they are coming together to work on these issues, and it is breaking down silos that have existed, in some cases, for many, many years. So, for example, there has been a prohibition at the federal level on using any funding for syringe exchange every year except one since 1988. Last year, for the first time since 1988, Mitch McConnell voted to authorize funding for syringe exchange, and that was because people in his state were dying of heroin overdose. And North Carolina just came on board with syringe exchange, and they're popping up all over the state, and they're popping up in really unique and interesting places. So you've got Baptist churches in North Carolina that are opening up syringe exchange programs in response to the opioid epidemic. It's something that is affecting them deeply and personally, and they're willing to say, okay, we're willing to do something about this. So this is the beauty of what you're doing here, what you're talking about in your local communities and with each other. So to sort of close things up here, go forth, do more, break molds, get outside the box, go have fun this evening, open bar. Thank you very much.
I could have probably just let him have the last word since those were such good ones. But I am going to wrap us up just with a couple words, super short, 30 seconds, and then just to outline quickly what we're doing tomorrow, and then to say have fun this evening. We started this morning, I shared with you that I had a couple of real core beliefs around how we approach these things. One was that we should be emphasizing prevention, and another was that a really good way to help tackle these things is to open-mindedly have intelligent people sit at tables together. And all of what I've heard today have completely reinforced these things. I would add a third ingredient now after listening to the remarks throughout the day. And this also reminds me of a story about, I told you I was a young crime reporter who wanted to go to an autopsy. I was also the young crime reporter when the Klamath Falls Police Department first got tasers. Who was the first one to volunteer to be tased? This girl, right? So, not the smartest thing I've ever done. But, dare I say, it was brave. And I think that that's another ingredient in this work that we are all doing together. Let's continue to sit at tables together. Let's continue to be open-minded, and let's all continue to be brave. I challenge you to do that. Tomorrow morning, we will pick up with the Multnomah County's annual What Works in Public Safety part of the conference. That will be in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we'll pick up really the Justice Reinvestment piece. Some great sessions, really opportunities for the actual lipsticks to spend some more time together and for us to continue to collaborate and learn. Thank you so much for your attention today. You've been an excellent audience. Enjoy the reception and continue your good work in your communities. Thank you.